George Meade was a Pennsylvania engineer and a capable soldier who became the victor of Gettysburg. George Meade, the Union general who commanded at the most decisive battle of the Civil War, was born in Cadiz, Spain on December 31, 1815. He came from a distinguished Philadelphia family. He had a reserved and scholarly demeanor. Meade's early years were marked by financial hardship. He attended the United States Military Academy at West Point, graduating in 1835 ranked 19th in a class of 56. After graduation, he served briefly in the artillery before resigning from the army in 1836 to pursue a career in civil engineering. The young Meade worked on various engineering projects including railroad surveys and lighthouse construction along the Atlantic coast. In 1842, facing economic difficulties, Meade rejoined the army as a second lieutenant in the Corps of Topographical Engineers. He married Margaretta Sargent, the daughter of a prominent Philadelphia congressman, and they would have 7 children together. Meade's engineering skills proved valuable to the military. He surveyed the Texas-Mexico border and worked on lighthouse projects along the Delaware Bay and the Florida coast. When the Mexican-American War erupted in 1846, Meade served under General Zachary Taylor. He participated in the battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, demonstrating courage under fire. He was brevetted first lieutenant for gallant conduct during the war. After the Mexican War, Meade returned to engineering duties, designing lighthouses and conducting geodetic surveys along the Atlantic seaboard. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 transformed Meade's career. At the age of 45, he was appointed Brigadier General of Volunteers. Meade was not a political general like so many of his contemporaries. He earned his position through professional competence and military experience. He commanded a brigade of Pennsylvania reserves and saw action in the Peninsula Campaign of 1862. At the Battle of Glendale during the 7 Days Battles, Meade was severely wounded, shot through the arm and back. The wounds nearly killed him. He was hit by musket balls that passed dangerously close to his spine. Meade recovered and returned to duty within months, demonstrating the physical toughness that would characterize his military service. In August 1862, Meade fought at the Second Battle of Bull Run, where Union forces under General John Pope suffered a devastating defeat. Meade's division performed creditably despite the overall Union collapse. At the Battle of South Mountain in September 1862, Meade again distinguished himself, and at Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history, his division helped secure crucial ground. His performance caught the attention of his superiors. Meade was promoted to command of the 5th Corps. He was known for his quick temper and his profane outbursts when things went wrong. His staff nicknamed him the Old Snapping Turtle because of his irritable disposition and his tendency to lash out at subordinates. But beneath the harsh exterior was a dedicated professional who demanded excellence from himself and others. At the Battle of Fredericksburg in December 1862, Meade's division achieved the only Union breakthrough of the day, temporarily penetrating the Confederate lines at a weak point in Stonewall Jackson's position. However, lack of support prevented Meade from exploiting the advantage, and the Union Army suffered a terrible defeat. The loss at Fredericksburg demoralized the Army of the Potomac. President Lincoln replaced General Ambrose Burnside with General Joseph Hooker. Meade continued to command the 5th Corps under Hooker. At the Battle of Chancellorsville in May 1863, Hooker's army was outmaneuvered by Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson despite having superior numbers. The Confederate victory at Chancellorsville was brilliant but costly. Jackson was mortally wounded by friendly fire, depriving Lee of his most trusted lieutenant. After Chancellorsville, Lee decided to invade the North again, hoping a victory on Union soil might force Lincoln to negotiate peace. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia marched into Pennsylvania in June 1863. The invasion created panic in northern cities. Hooker quarreled with his superiors and offered his resignation. On June 28, 1863, just 3 days before the Battle of Gettysburg, George Meade was awakened in the middle of the night and informed that he was now commander of the Army of the Potomac. Meade was shocked by the appointment. He had not sought the position and felt unprepared for the enormous responsibility. He inherited an army of 90,000 men facing an immediate crisis with an enemy army already on northern soil. Meade had no time to reorganize or implement new strategies. He had to take command on the march and respond to a rapidly developing situation. Meade was not a charismatic leader like some of his predecessors. He was methodical, cautious, and professional. He lacked the political connections that had elevated other generals. But he understood military engineering, terrain, and logistics. He positioned his army to protect Washington and Baltimore while seeking to bring Lee to battle on favorable ground. The two armies converged on the small Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg on July 1, 1863. The battle began almost by accident when Confederate forces searching for supplies encountered Union cavalry. The fighting escalated rapidly as both sides rushed reinforcements to the scene. The first day went badly for the Union. Confederate forces drove the Union troops through Gettysburg and onto the high ground south of town, including Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. Meade arrived at Gettysburg after midnight on July 2. He surveyed the Union position in the darkness, consulting with his corps commanders. The Union line formed a fishhook shape along Cemetery Ridge, Cemetery Hill, and Culp's Hill. Meade recognized the strength of the position. The high ground gave his artillery excellent fields of fire. His interior lines allowed him to shift troops quickly to threaten points. He decided to fight at Gettysburg rather than retreat. On July 2, Lee attacked both flanks of the Union position. Confederate General James Longstreet's corps assaulted the Union left at places that would become famous: the Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, Devil's Den, and Little Round Top. The fighting was ferocious and desperate. Union General Dan Sickles advanced his corps forward without orders, creating a salient that was nearly destroyed. Meade rushed reinforcements to plug the gaps. At Little Round Top, the extreme left of the Union line, a small force including the 20th Maine Infantry under Colonel Joshua Chamberlain held off repeated Confederate assaults. If Little Round Top had fallen, the Confederate artillery could have enfiladed the entire Union position. The hill was saved by desperate fighting and a famous bayonet charge. Meade personally directed reinforcements throughout the day, riding along the lines under fire, moving troops to threatened sectors. On the Union right, Confederate forces attacked Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill as darkness fell. The attacks were repulsed, but the day had been close. Meade held a council of war with his generals that night. They voted to stay and fight. Meade predicted that Lee, having attacked both flanks, would strike the center the next day. July 3, 1863 was the climactic day of the battle. Lee ordered a massive assault on the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. The attack would be preceded by the largest artillery bombardment of the war. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, over 150 Confederate cannons opened fire. The Union artillery responded. For nearly 2 hours, the cannonade shook the earth. Then came silence as the Confederate guns ceased fire to conserve ammunition for the infantry assault. Meade had positioned himself near the center of his line, the point he expected Lee to attack. He watched as 12,000 Confederate soldiers under General George Pickett and others emerged from the woods and began their advance across 3/4 of a mile of open ground. It was a magnificent and terrible sight. The Confederate advance, known forever after as Pickett's Charge, was doomed from the start. Union artillery tore gaps in the advancing lines. As the Confederates came within rifle range, Union infantry rose from behind stone walls and poured devastating fire into the assault. A few hundred Confederates reached the Union line at a point called the Angle, breaking through briefly in what became known as the high water mark of the Confederacy. But they were quickly overwhelmed and driven back. The assault collapsed. More than half the attacking force was killed, wounded, or captured. Lee's army had been defeated. Meade had won the greatest battle of the Civil War. On July 4, Lee began his retreat. Meade pursued but cautiously. His own army had suffered 23,000 casualties and was exhausted. Heavy rain swelled the Potomac River, trapping Lee's army against the flooded river. Lincoln urged Meade to attack and destroy Lee's army, ending the war. But Meade hesitated. He called a council of war and his generals advised against attacking Lee's fortified position. When the river fell, Lee escaped across the Potomac. Lincoln was bitterly disappointed. He felt Meade had let victory slip away. Lincoln wrote an angry letter to Meade but never sent it. The letter expressed the president's frustration that the war would continue. Meade learned of Lincoln's displeasure and offered to resign. Lincoln refused the resignation, but the relationship was strained. Meade remained commander of the Army of the Potomac for the rest of the war, but his role changed. In March 1864, Ulysses S. Grant was promoted to lieutenant general and given command of all Union armies. Grant made his headquarters with the Army of the Potomac, effectively supervising Meade's operations. This created an awkward command structure. Meade remained the official commander, but Grant was present and making strategic decisions. Meade handled the situation with professional grace, subordinating his ego to the war effort. He understood that Grant's presence was necessary and accepted the diminished role. The two generals developed a working relationship based on mutual respect. The Overland Campaign of 1864 was a brutal series of battles as Grant drove toward Richmond. At the Battle of the Wilderness in May 1864, the armies fought in dense forest where visibility was measured in yards. The fighting was savage and inconclusive. At Spotsylvania Court House, the armies clashed again in some of the most intense combat of the war. The bloody angle at Spotsylvania saw 20 hours of continuous hand-to-hand fighting. At Cold Harbor in June 1864, Grant ordered a frontal assault that resulted in 7,000 Union casualties in less than an hour. It was one of Grant's worst decisions. Throughout these battles, Meade commanded the tactical operations of the Army of the Potomac while Grant set the overall strategy. Grant's strategy differed from previous Union commanders. He would not retreat after setbacks. He kept moving south, forcing Lee to fight battle after battle. The campaign was a war of attrition. The Union could replace its losses, the Confederacy could not. After Cold Harbor, Grant crossed the James River and laid siege to Petersburg, the railroad hub south of Richmond. The siege of Petersburg lasted from June 1864 until April 1865. It was a preview of the trench warfare that would characterize World War I 50 years later. The armies dug elaborate fortifications. Soldiers lived in trenches for months. Mining operations tunneled under enemy positions. The Battle of the Crater in July 1864 saw Union forces detonate a massive mine under Confederate lines, creating a crater 170 feet long and 30 feet deep. The subsequent Union assault was a disaster, with troops trapped in the crater and slaughtered. Meade continued to command the Army of the Potomac through the siege, though his contributions were overshadowed by Grant's presence. The press largely ignored Meade, crediting victories to Grant and blaming failures on Meade. Meade resented the unfair treatment but remained focused on his duties. He was a professional soldier who believed in the chain of command and military discipline. In April 1865, Grant finally broke through the Petersburg defenses. Lee's army retreated west, hoping to escape and continue the war. Grant pursued relentlessly. Meade and the Army of the Potomac participated in the final pursuit. On April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Court House. The Civil War was effectively over. Meade had commanded the Army of the Potomac from Gettysburg to Appomattox, a longer tenure than any other commander of that army. After the war, Meade remained in the army. He commanded various military departments during Reconstruction. He administered military rule in the South, a difficult and thankless task. Meade tried to balance enforcement of federal authority with fairness to the defeated Southern population. He commanded the Military Division of the Atlantic, overseeing the Department of the East. He was promoted to Major General in the regular army. Unlike Grant, who became president, or Sherman, who became commanding general of the army, Meade remained in relative obscurity. His reserved personality and lack of political ambition kept him from the public spotlight. He never wrote memoirs or sought to promote his own legacy. Meade's health, never robust after his wounds at Glendale, declined in the years after the war. He suffered from pneumonia and complications from his old injuries. On November 6, 1872, George Gordon Meade died in Philadelphia at the age of 56. He was buried in Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia. At his death, he was remembered primarily as the victor of Gettysburg, though his contributions to the final Union victory were much broader. Grant said of Meade that he was a brave and conscientious officer who did his duty under all circumstances. Sherman called him an honest, true soldier. Meade's reputation suffered in the decades after the war as other generals published memoirs and shaped the historical narrative. Dan Sickles, whose insubordination at Gettysburg nearly lost the battle, spent years attacking Meade's reputation, claiming credit for the victory. Modern historians have reassessed Meade's contributions. He was an extremely competent army commander who won the most important battle of the war at a crucial moment. He took command 3 days before Gettysburg with no preparation and defeated Robert E. Lee, the Confederacy's best general. He commanded the Army of the Potomac for nearly 2 years, longer than McClellan, Burnside, Hooker, or any other commander. He worked effectively under Grant's supervision, subordinating his ego to the mission. He was a professional soldier in an era of political generals, a trained engineer who understood logistics and terrain. His caution after Gettysburg may have prolonged the war, but his victory at Gettysburg may have saved the Union. Without the victory at Gettysburg, Confederate independence might have been recognized by European powers, or Northern voters might have elected a peace candidate in 1864. Meade was not a brilliant innovator or a charismatic leader. He did not revolutionize warfare or inspire devotion in his troops. But he was competent, professional, and reliable. He won when winning mattered most. He served his country with dedication and honor, asking nothing for himself. In an army plagued by incompetent political appointees and glory-seeking egotists, Meade was a steady professional who did his job. His victory at Gettysburg turned the tide of the Civil War. His leadership of the Army of the Potomac from 1863 to 1865 contributed to the final Union victory. George Gordon Meade was a soldier's soldier, a professional officer who exemplified duty and service. He may not have sought fame or glory, but his contributions to preserving the United States were immeasurable. When the nation needed a general who could defeat Robert E. Lee, George Meade answered the call and delivered victory at Gettysburg.